so I just in Shira we covered really pretty much the first three CE theme of Kufhe. And I just kind of like maybe just a brief overview to begin with is we're talking about, when do we actually, what kind of processes actually transfer flavor from an isur to a heter, and so how does something become asur? And so we actually start out, we'll go from the Shulchan Aruch and we'll look at a couple side pieces here. But just starting in Seif Aleph, right? Isur, and this comes to us, we already saw in the previous Siman of the Shulchan Aruch, the whole question that was brought up by the Tosfot and the Rosh of how if a mouse or a rat or whatever it is falls into beer, how could there be a problem? It's cold. And we saw this issue of, well, potentially it was there for a long period of time. We'll see, and that might actually cause a transfer of tam. So Isur shenishre im heter me'et la'et betzonen mikre kavush v'harehu, and then it's next page was kimuvushal, right? V'nesar kulo. So we see this idea that if you have a cold interaction, you have an isur in a heter, but it's for the moment we'll call it cold. We won't get into the complications of cold-hot interactions yet. That'll be in Gimel. But if it's there for 24 hours, and we saw this was actually a debate. There's actually an opinion based on a Gemara and Avodah Zarah about how you kind of kasher a wine barrel that's had yain nesach in it. That maybe there's one opinion that says it's 3 days, but generally we rule it's 1 day. And so for a 24-hour period, if it sits there, then it becomes like bishul. And so v'nesar kulo, the whole thing becomes asur, right? There's a transfer of flavor throughout the entire thing. Aval pachot mikan badachasagi, but anything less than that, you can rinse it off. That's enough to solve any interaction problems. So you have let's say you have a heter that falls into a non-kosher cold soup. You could, if it sits there for 24 hours, I say soup. For the moment, it sounds like any liquid, and I'll make a comment about that in a minute, but it falls into cold soup. You can pull it out, you can rinse it off. But if that heter sits in that isur for 24 hours, then the whole thing is asur. It's been penetrated now with the isur flavor. And I was going to say, so we also saw a debate, even though about whether or not this is the case only for certain liquids like sear, brine, and chometz vinegar, or it's possible that it's just all interaction, all liquids, and the way the Shulchan Aruch seems to paskin the Beit Yosef, we saw this that he comes down on the side of all liquids, and his proof for that was the whole idea where we get this idea of kavush kim vushal is that the exception to that rule is basar b'chalav, and there we're talking about basar that falls into milk. And so if there would have been a hava minif, except for the fact that it's a chidush, that basar in milk for 24 hours, which milk of course is not chometz or sear or anything like that, would cause a flavor interaction, then it must be the case for all liquids. And I wanted to just point out that actually, let me do the Haggah first. And that, so the Ramah says, "V'chol makom damrin and kavush kimvushal afilu masha chutz lakvisha asur da'idei kvisha shel lamata mefafea lamala kemo b'bishul." So I imagine you have now, like a pile of, heter food in isur liquid. Even the stuff that's outside of the liquid would be transfer of flavor all the way up. And that would be a problem if it's sitting there for 24 hours. But V'yesh makilini says, though, b'mashi b'chutz, for the stuff that's outside of the liquid. Yeah, go ahead, Rav Nahu.
Yeah, I have a question. As far as the rinsing off that you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
What if it's something like cracked grapes?
Oh,
where it may absorb through the surface.
Yeah, no, it's a major problem of we saw this actually,
like
right?
Cooked meat that is cracked.
Yeah, we saw that in fact that it's a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, right? The whole idea, or we have a case where I think it was yain nesach there falls on open grapes, right? Was that I think they were grapes in that case. and that's a problem. You can't do hadacha. So it's a sore.
So we would have liked the Shulchan Aruch to have. We would have liked the Shulchan Aruch to have differentiated a little bit there.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's
Presumably, I mean, unless he's saying there is no differentiation.
yeah, you would think things that are non-rinsable, that absorb without rinsing.
Right.
Although I imagine for those, right, for something you can do hadacha on, you could also take, at least I'm trying to think, you could probably take netilas makom at least, and be okay, right? I imagine it doesn't absorb all the way through. But if I remember correctly, also there's another place the Shulchan Aruch also comments that for things that we don't normally do hadacha. What was that? I lost for, but things that we don't normally do hadacha on, we also are very careful about, right? If it's something that that you're not usually doing hadacha on, it might be that might also be a problem. So, but yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And right.
Okay, go ahead.
No, it's so the Ramah comments v'yesh makilim b'mashi b'chutz, but he says, we're leaning about stuff that's outside of the liquid. And actually, I just the Be'er Hatev, he comments on that. I have to find it again. But he quotes the Shach that from the Torah, who quotes the Torah Chatat. Niresh ken ikar be'isur kachush, right? If we have a non-fatty, a lean, that's the word I'm looking for. If you have a lean isur that's sitting outside the liquid, right? We'll get to this later in several classes down the line about the difference between kachush and shamen, whether or not it's a fatty or non-fatty piece of food. But those foods don't really kind of transfer flavor as well. The fat is a flavor transfer, shall we say, engine or something like that. And he says, "Ve'afagav de'anan lo mechalkinan ben kachush shamen." But we will see this, and we normally we don't really know what's fatty, what's not fatty in most cases. But that he says, "Hainu b'milicha u'tzliya." That's only for roasting and for salting. Uchai gavne aval kule hai lo nachmir. But for this kind of stuff, we're not. We'll take the makil route. We're not going to be so machmir about it. All right. And the Ramah continues, says v'safek kavush asur. Even if safek, like we didn't know, was it there for 24 hours? Was it not? And that's actually exactly what the Taz says about it, right? We don't know if it's a full day. All right, it's that's still asur. Except, and what's wrong? One exception, which I mentioned, is basar im chalav dezlin lekula demina Torah eino asur rak b'vishul mamash, right? Because the Torah, the real isra on basar b'chalav is for cooking the two together, actual cooking the two together, and therefore we're makil for the safek case, and also as we learned it's not asur b'hana'ah if my meat sat in my milk for 24 hours. Like I can't eat it, but I at the same time I can sell it to a non-Jew. I can give it, get the tovah from that, something like that. So, okay, let's see if I had anything else for Aleph. Oh yes, one more thing is that there's I think this was here. Oh no, no, it's the next one. So let's oh yeah, so he keeps going. We're back on the Shulchan Aruch. Vimu kavush b'toch sir or b'toch chometz. Im sha'kadeshi tenenu ala or v'artiach v'achili pashel hareu kimvushal. So this is the case. Well, what about sharper liquids like brine or vinegar? There, it doesn't have to sit for 24 hours. It's as long as it would take if you put that on a fire for it to cook. It's a little bit of an ambiguous measure. But they may have had consistent fires or something people just kind of knew. I don't know. But that's enough. Let's say often it's taken as 18 minutes or so. Right? But if it's less than that, then you take a klipa. You take the top layer off the food, and you're okay. and I just want for chometz though, it was interesting. The Shach and the Beratef summarizes this. He says that tzarich iyun. This is the Daled and the Beratef. I'll read it from there. Because he says in Kuf Daled, the Mechaber ruled, de bechometz tzarich gam ken lishrot meit la'et ayen sham. All right, there it seems that for chometz, not for vinegar, but not for tzir, not for brine, but for vinegar, that actually takes 24 hours. And so therefore the Shach decides that actually for vinegar you need 24 hours, not the 18 minutes. So that's a really interesting where he's makil on that issue. So that's Sif Aleph. So I just, let's see how my time, all right, 2:20. So I'll do Sif Bet, which is Bet is gonna, now we've done, interaction in a cold medium. Now we're gonna do the question of what about a hot thing in something that was actually on the fire versus like a vessel that wasn't on the fire. And so Bet starts out in the Shulchan Aruch, Chom shel kli rishon, shayad soledet bo, mevashel ve'oser kulo. All right, so if it's so hot that your hand recoils from it, we didn't talk that much in class about what that is. The Gemara itself says that's the temperature at which a baby's stomach burns if you poured like hot oil on them. I still doesn't help, but I think usually a lot of people say, like, I've heard everything from 115 to 130 Fahrenheit. If I'm not quick at converting to Celsius, maybe somebody else could do that. But that's if you get to that, a kli rishon. So kli rishon is something that's on the fire, that was on the fire. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the fire now. But you had a pot, it was on the fire, you remove it from the fire, it's still, let's say at 180 degrees or something like that, will make it much higher. That is still, there's still bishul going on. So if you drop something in there, it'd be mevushal. And ve'oser kulo. So if I drop, so I'm cooking, or somebody's cooking non-kosher broth, and I drop, something kosher in there, and it's still that hot, even if it's off the fire, the whole thing is asur. But aval chom shel kli sheni eino mevashel. But if it's in a secondary vessel, so I have that non-kosher broth, I poured it into a bowl, let's say, and then you drop a kosher piece of something in there, that isn't being cooked so far. All right, and he says, and there are people who say that it doesn't even have a flavor transfer going on. And this is where we start to get a distinction between bishul and flavor transfer, exuding and absorbing flavor. And there's some who actually, there's an opinion that does say, actually, yes, there is a transfer of flavor, even in a kli sheni, if it's above yad soledet bo, and it the outer layer has absorption of the iser.
It's funny how the Shulchan Aruch writes it, because it sounds like there are three opinions.
Yeah,
but there's really only two.
Exactly. Yeah, it really is one opinion that the bishul and maflit are the same thing, and therefore it's not mevash. Everyone agrees it's not mevashel, seemingly, according to the way the Shulchan Aruch writes it. It's a whole question of, but does it transfer flavor even if it's not bishul? So maybe for Shabbat purposes it's fine, but there might be for Isser Heter purposes a problem. And we'll look actually in a minute. I want to just read when I finish this, the Chochmat Adam and how he kind of rules on all this, which is kind of interesting. But the Shulchan Aruch himself concludes, usually, of course, what lechatchila means here is a whole interesting question. But we'll actually see a case in the Chochmat Adam where he actually has a nice lechatchila case. But aval b'diavad mutar below klipa v'hadacha be'al masagi. Right there, maybe if it already happened, or post facto, we'll call it that for the moment. It's permissible even without taking that klipa, and it's enough to just rinse it off. Of course, what happens if you can't even rinse it is an interesting question here. But I do want to read from there. From the Chochmat Adam and how he writes it. People don't know the Chochmat Adam. Rav Danzig, who from Danzig in the, I believe he lives all the way from the 18th and 19th century, if I remember correctly. And he writes, this is in Klal Nun Tet, I think he doesn't call them Seifim, I can't remember what he calls them, but Halakha Vav maybe. Hom Kli Sheni, Afilo Hayad Sholet Bo B'diavad Mutar, Vein Tzarich Afilo Klipa Bimkom Hefsed. He says, right, the heat of a secondary vessel, the klisheni, even if it's above yad zelerepo, b'diavad is permissible, and you don't even need to take a klipa if there's a loss, right? Because the truth is, he says, klisheni doesn't really transfer flavor. He says, v'chem b'chli cheres yesh le'achmir b'chli sheni sheyad zelerepo im lo bimkom hefsed. All right, he says, and also, though, for if it's a kli cheres, we should actually be machmir if there's not a loss. All right. V'lacharchila asur, and this is where he gets the case. Limlog of afilu b'kli sheni shayad selerepo. Right. This is a whole case where you need to to make it easier to get rid of the feathers of a chicken is to put it into hot water. Apparently, I've never plucked a chicken, of course, right, this chicken, the blood is still in it, right? If you put this thing in the hot water and it cooks, there's a major problem. You've transferred flavor of Isser things into the heter meat. And he says, and so I guess this is what people would do to make it easier to pluck the feathers. He said you can't do that, he says, right? Because that there might be mavli or maflit, or at least we're machmir about it. Aval, right? He says aval lichvod Shabbat or achim ve'ifshar binyan acher sheserich harbe levasar v'basar maleh kerach she'efshar lemocho kach mutar lanicho b'chli sheni afil lechatchila. Right? He says, like, let's say you have a bunch of people coming over and you will have this, frozen chicken. It's wintertime in Poland and you need to get rid of the feathers. You can do this, and since you can put it in very hot water in a kli sheni. And it's not a problem because you have a hefsed, you have people coming over, you really need this meat, then it's permissible. But otherwise, we're machmir about this. So that was a really interesting case that he brought there. And
he comes out, but in Rove cases, this is actually halakha l'maisa. They use hot water, I believe, to pluck chickens. So even today. They still do. I didn't know. Actually in the standard. I think they do. I believe they do. It's a big question about how to pluck a chicken. Anyway, so he's actually coming out l'chumra in general.
Yeah, but which is really interesting. I didn't. I should probably ask. We had once a turkey shechted for us when we lived in Seattle. There's a rabbi, the Rabbi Ben Zaken, who does shlita. He killed did shlita on a bunch of turkeys. And some friends of ours were there. We were in town, but they did the plucking. But I think they did it all just by hand. That's the best I know about plucking feathers. But I do want to say that the Taz also has kind of a nice summary of this. And this is in Sif Katan Dalid, he's got a long thing about this and the Marshal's objection to the idea of being makil about a klisheni. And he's, of course, I wrote down how it starts, but I didn't actually mark it, so I have to find it quickly here. He starts uliyan maseh yesh lifsok lechumra kedat rashal bifrat she'atur sfira legam ken kachi rab bimkom hefsed gadol udvar chashuv yesh lismoch al beit Yosef. Right, so he says, look, we should be machmir like the Marshal, and the Torah seems to go that way as well. But similar to the Chochmat Adam, he says if there's a hefsed gadol, here he said the Chochmat Adam said hefsed, here he says hefsed gadol, right? Or there's something very important like Shabbat, we can rely on the Beit Yosef's being makil on this. So good. So I have only a few more minutes. So I just want to do a little bit of Gimel here, which we also did, and this is there's a debate in the Gemara about what if I have a cold-hot interaction? And so here we'll start vertically, where you have something hot falling to something cold, or something cold falling into something hot, and Rav rules that ila agavar, that the top thing is what kind of dominates, and therefore if the top thing is hot and the bottom thing is cold, that would be considered to be just a hot interaction. But he actually usually for Isurim, we rule like Rav. In this case, we don't, because there's two brightot that support Shmuel, who says tata gavar, and that becomes a halacha. It's about the bottom subject, bottom food. And so Gimel nafal isur cham latoch heter cham dechli rishon o afilu isur tzonen latoch heter cham hakol asur de tata gavar. Right, so you have the heat of a kli rishon, and you have it doesn't matter what if the object that falls into it is hot or cold. If the thing on the bottom here he has letoch heter cham, then there's it's all asur because there's a transfer of flavor. But the tata gavar al yonut mechamo ad shemaflit betachton vein tzarich lomar te'tertzon en letoch isur, and it says same. You don't even need to say. It's obvious that the opposite way, where it's a heter into an isur, as long as the bottom thing is hot, that everything is asur. Aval email yon cham vetachton sonen eino aser el kedei klipa afilu email hayon cham hacham isur. Right, it says if the top thing is hot, but the bottom is cold, then you just need to take a klipa, and it's even the case if the top thing was the isur. But let's see. I'll take Kohen where it's just the Ramah, because I think the Ramah is important here. He says, "V'chol zelo ma'ire ela bechom kli rishon kegon miyad shesira min ha'esh manicho imayater." All right. And this is right. We're dealing with a kli rishon, right? You took it off the fire. He says miyad. In other words, it hasn't cooled down yet, and then it interacts with the heter. Aval im kavar munach b'kli sheni. But if it's in a kli sheni ve'achar kach miniach heter etzlo or alav eino oser klal de kli sheni eino oser kamosheni bayar. He says kli sheni we saw doesn't. Although we actually are somewhat machmir about it per the Marshal. But he says here we're makel in a klisheni about this case. So what if it's a horizontal case where the two things are interacting but neither is on top? Im shnehem chamim mi chom kli rishon hakol asur v'im echad sonen im echad sonen haeter tzarich klipa bimkom shenaga. But so if it's hot, then everything's asur. If one of them is cold, you need klipa. All right. The place where but only the place where they touched, right? Not the other side of it. So what if it's a food vessel interaction? Amrinan be gamken din tata agavar kemo b'shtei chatichot. All right, that's the same as a food interaction. We say that the bottom is what dominates. So an isur kli that's hot. If something kosher falls into it, that's a problem. There's a transfer of flavor. But if it's a hot piece of food of, let's say, isur food that falls into a cold kli, that's let's say less of a problem. There might be kedei klipa there. And we'll see more of that, I think, when we go back to basar b'chalav. But just to finish up, he says asur le'arot michli sheyesh bo shuman kasher. Actually, I'm going to skip this piece because it's just based on time, and I don't think it's a case that so much shows up. So let's see. I had one more ber hetev I wanted to look at. You know what? We'll do it next, just based on the time. We'll do it next time with when we finish up. I think we're taking one more week on Kufay. So, all right, Kol Tuv, and
all right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rav.